check into terror. The forgotten hotel. The rain fell in sheets, a cold, merciless torrent that made the world beyond the windows seem like a shadowy blur. You'd been driving for hours, longer than you'd meant to, and your car sputtered and coughed, a quiet protest against the relentless downpour. The GPS, like some cruel trickster, had lost its signal miles ago, leaving you adrift in an unfamiliar landscape. The only thing in sight was the flickering neon sign of a motel on the side of the road, the Hollowbrook Inn. Its dim light pulsed like a heartbeat, weak and uncertain, but it was enough. You needed shelter. You pulled into the gravel lot with a squeal of tires, the sound lost in the heavy thrum of the storm. The air was thick, stale, and smelled faintly of mildew. The inn stood like a forgotten monument to something once alive, now decayed and hollow. The peeling paint on the walls was the least of its problems. Windows, some cracked, some blacked out, stared out at you like hollow eyes. The doors were heavy, rusted, their hinges groaning as if begging to be left alone. As you stepped out of the car, the wind howled, tugging at your clothes, but it wasn't the cold that made your skin crawl. It was the silence. It felt wrong, as though the world itself had held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Something terrible. You shook off the feeling and made your way toward the entrance. A single bell above the door jingled as you pushed it open. The lobby was poorly lit, with moth-eaten carpeting and ancient furniture arranged in an almost oppressive, claustrophobic manner. A faint, unsettling hum filled the air, like the sound of distant whispers. At the front desk, a woman sat hunched over, scribbling something furiously into a leather-bound notebook. She didn't look up as you approached, but you could feel her eyes on you, eyes that weren't quite normal. Too wide. Too focused. Room for one. Her voice was soft, but it held an edge, like it had been worn thin by years of disuse. You nodded. Just a single for tonight. She didn't speak, but instead slid a key across the desk. The number on it was barely legible, faded with time. Room 13. You didn't question it. It was a cheap motel. Who really cared about numbers? Stay as long as you need, she said, her voice trailing off as she returned to her scribbling, her eyes still never leaving you. A strange chill crawled up your spine, but you pushed it aside. With the key in hand, you walked down the narrow hallway. The floorboards creaked with every step, the sound echoing in the otherwise unnatural silence. The walls here were stained, yellowed with age, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. There was something suffocating about it, like the very building itself was trying to pull the life from you. As you reached room 13, you hesitated for a moment. You didn't know why. The door didn't look any different from the others, yet something about it felt off. It was as if something were waiting behind it, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. You unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was cold. Not in a comfortable way, but in a way that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The air was thick with dust, and the single bulb above the bed flickered erratically, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. There was a dresser in the corner, its drawers slightly ajar, and a full-length mirror that looked as though it hadn't been cleaned in years. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled in a heap, as if someone had left in a hurry. You weren't sure if you wanted to touch anything in the room, as though just laying your hand on anything would make it worse. You pulled the curtains closed, but when you turned back to the room, you could swear something had changed. The shadows were deeper, longer, as though they were creeping toward you. There was a strange feeling in the air now, something oppressive, something dark. A knock at the door. Soft, insistent. You froze. It couldn't have been the front desk. The woman had not moved from her chair when you left, and there had been no one else on the property. No other guests. You hadn't seen anyone else. You opened the door slowly, heart pounding in your chest. A man stood there. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes sunken into his skull as though he hadn't seen sunlight in years. He smiled at you, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was sharp, too wide, and his teeth were unnaturally white against the pallor of his skin. Room 13, he said softly, his voice a hoarse whisper that made your stomach turn. It's safe here, but only for a while. You should leave before it comes. The words hung in the air like a curse, and you could feel the temperature drop even further. The man turned away before you could respond, walking down the hall with deliberate, measured steps, vanishing into the shadows. A deep, primal fear gnawed at you. That word echoed in your head, repeating over and over, but something kept you rooted to the spot. You couldn't leave. Not yet. You closed the door and locked it, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The shadows were moving now. They weren't just shadows. They were waiting. A whisper brushed against your ear. Stay, just a little longer. Before you could react, the room's only light flickered and then went out completely, plunging you into complete darkness. You stood there frozen. The whispers, they were louder now, close enough to feel the cold breath on your neck. And then, in the darkness, you heard the door handle turn. Don't forget to subscribe. You'll need to before it finds you too. The room seemed to pulse with life, the air thickening with something malevolent. Something ancient. Something that shouldn't have been disturbed. And now it was aware of you. But it's too late. You're already a part of it. The darkness was suffocating. The tangible. You stood frozen, the silence of the room pressing down on you like a physical weight. The door handle rattled again, slow and deliberate, each turn of the metal like a warning, a promise that whatever was on the other side of that door was no longer just outside, it was inside. The whispers were growing louder, circling around you like a swarm of unseen insects, their voices muffled but unmistakably sinister. Stay, just a little longer. The words came again, but they weren't just whispers. They felt like they were inside your mind now, digging into your thoughts, crawling through your very consciousness. The room, once still, felt alive. Alive with something ancient, something unspeakable. The air was thick with a presence that pressed against your skin, making it crawl, making your pulse race faster, the blood thumping in your ears. And then the lights flickered once, twice, and went out completely, leaving you alone in pitch-black darkness. You could still feel the space around you shifting, as though the room itself was changing, warping. There was a soft, barely audible creak from the corner of the room. The floorboards shifted, groaned, and then something dragged across the floor toward you. You couldn't breathe. You couldn't move. From the corner of your eye, the shadows in the room seemed to stretch unnaturally. They reached, they moved as if they were alive, as if they were reaching for you, toward you. You heard the soft scrape of something sharp against the wood, the unmistakable sound of nails, or claws, scratching the walls. The door behind you rattled again. A soft, chilling giggle echoed in the room. It wasn't human. Not even close. He shouldn't have stayed. He should have left before it found him. You could hear the man's voice, the man who had knocked earlier, rising from the darkness, distorted as though it was being carried on the wind, but it felt like it was coming from all directions, filling your mind with the words, the terrible truth he had spoken, until they made sense. It was too late. You shouldn't have stayed. You felt the temperature drop even further. Ice-cold fingers brushed against your neck, a cold so deep, so unnatural, that it felt as though the very essence of the room was trying to steal the warmth from your body. The whispers now became screams, but they weren't the screams of a person. They were screams of something far worse, something old, something hungry. They gnawed at your mind, gnawed at your soul. They felt like they were clawing their way out of your own chest. The bed beneath you shifted. It was moving. Your legs felt like stone, your body too heavy to move. The shadows in the corner of the room grew darker, deeper, and then they shifted, morphing into something far more tangible. Two glowing, empty eyes opened from the darkness, watching you with an intensity that paralyzed you with terror. You could feel it, the hunger. The door handle turned again, more violently this time. But you couldn't move to stop it. You couldn't even scream. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from the corner where the shadows had begun to take shape. And then the figure emerged. It was too tall. Its limbs were elongated, twisted. Its body was an impossible distortion, with skin that looked like rotting leather stretched over bone. Its mouth was far too wide, the lips cracked and peeling back to reveal rows of jagged teeth that seemed to go on forever, each one sharp enough to tear through flesh. The thing's eyes were hollow, black pits that swirled with an unnatural, pulsing light. It was watching you, hunting you. Its breath, sickly sweet, the stench of decay, filled the room, and the air seemed to thickly hum with the entity's presence, the pulse of something ancient that should have never been disturbed. And then, with an unsettling slowness, it began to speak. The words came from its mouth, but they weren't its own. They were the whispers you had been hearing all along. The voices you had thought were just figments of your imagination. They were all real, and they were now speaking through it. You have been chosen. The room was spinning. You couldn't hold on anymore. You could feel the darkness closing in, suffocating you, and the whispers. They weren't whispers anymore. They were thoughts, your thoughts, mingling with the ones you were hearing. They were inside your head. It has already begun. A grotesque, wet noise filled the room, and something cold pressed against your skin. The creature's claw-like hand, long, slender fingers tipped with bone, touched your cheek, dragging its sharp nails down your face, leaving a trail of searing pain behind them. You screamed, but no sound escaped your mouth. You opened your eyes, desperate to see, to understand, to escape, but all you saw was the thing's grin widening, its teeth growing, its eyes burning with a sickly light. You will never leave. And then the walls around you began to change. They warped, twisted, and groaned as though the very structure of the motel itself was coming alive, bending, stretching, shifting, pulling you in. You were sinking into the floor, the walls were closing in around you. And then, in the darkness, you saw it. Room 13. The words themselves seemed to bleed, dripping from the walls like blood, crawling up your spine. Suddenly, the room was filled with faces. Faces you couldn't recognize, faces of other guests who had come before you. Their eyes were wide, their mouths open in silent screams, their bodies twisted and distorted, their hands reaching out, begging for help that would never come. They were trapped. And now you were with them. A voice whispered in your ear. You will never leave. The hollow brook never lets anyone go. The last thing you saw before the world swallowed you whole was the reflection of your own face in the mirror, the reflection that wasn't you. It was the thing from the corner. It was grinning. And then there was nothing. The screen flickers and for a moment you feel it. Something is watching. You've listened. You've heard the story. But don't worry. You won't be alone for long. Subscribe. And make sure you never forget this place.